reverse motion. Now we start our trip to Silver Plume by backing out of the station for two reasons. The first is to give you a better view of the Devil's Gate High Bridge, which is currently behind us. It's much easier to see that structure from its underside than when we're going over the top. This is a near exact replica of the original, built on that site by the Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville Railway in the winter of 1883 and 1884. Upon completion, that bridge had cost almost $250,000. Quite a sum of money in that time. When it was cut up for scrap in 1939, it was sold off for less than $600. The new bridge went up in time for the railroad's 100th anniversary in 1984. It's made out of high-grade structural steel, which makes it 5 times stronger than the original bridge, and a little bit more expensive as well, $1.1 million to be exact. I refer to this as a near-exact replica because it does not share two things in common with the original bridge. You see, from day one, the original iron bridge had a very bad habit of sagging in the middle and swaying up to 4 to 6 inches off its center line with every train that went over it. Rest assured, though, while this looks like the original bridge, it does not move like the original, because if it did, none of your train crew would be here right now. For that sort of a thrill, we prefer to go down to Humus Gardens in Denver. The second reason we back down has to do with where we are right now. It is here beneath the bridge that the loop begins and ends. And by starting here underneath the bridge, you get a complete ride over the loop by first passing beneath the high bridge and then crossing over these very same tracks 75 feet above. Central Railroad. They built west out of Denver, following Clear Creek to Golden, then Arvada, and starting in 1870 began their climb up Clear Creek Canyon along the route now used by U.S. Highway 6. Colorado Central arrived in Georgetown in April of 1877, and at that point they paused their construction until 1879. During that time they created a brand new railroad company that would build the section you're riding today, and it would be known as the Georgetown, Breckenridge, and Leadville Railway, or GT&L for short. Construction on the Georgetown Loop began on February 22nd, 1881, with the first trains arriving in Silver Plume on April 1st, 1884. The next phase of construction was to have taken the railroad further west, following Clear Creek to its headwaters at the Loveland Basin. There, the railroad was going to tunnel through the Continental Divide and continue west to the rich mining camps of Breckenridge and Leadville. But they never made it that far. The railroad was only extended 5 miles west of Silver Plume to what is today known as Bakerville. At that time, the parent company of the GT&L bought out one of its competitors, the Denver South Park and Pacific Railroad. They had already reached Breckenridge by way of the South Platte Canyon. They were well on their way to Leadville. As a result of this purchase, there was no need to continue the extension of this part of the line any farther. And by 1897, the 5 miles of track west of Silver Plume had been torn out. Silver Plume had become the end of the line for the Clear Creek division of the railroad. By July 1899, many of the smaller narrow gauge companies in the region had merged and formed the Colorado Southern Railway. And that was the name this railroad was to keep until the very end. In its heyday, Colorado Southern brought the miners, their families, and much-needed supplies to the isolated mining towns. And in return, it took a small fortune in gold and silver back down to Denver, much faster, far less expensively than could ever have been dreamt of by the use of wagons alone. The severe downturn in the national economy in 1893, which was made all the worse by the repealing of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act that year, caused the price of silver to plummet to a point so low that they could no longer afford to mine it. One by one, silver mines in Clear Creek County shut down for good. Fortunately for the railroad, they'd already seen the writing on the wall for silver about a decade earlier, when, due to overproduction, the price of silver began a slow and steady decline. It was during that time the railroad began advertising itself as a tourist destination. By the time the bottom of the silver market fell out in 1893, folks just like yourselves were coming from around the world to ride what was considered one of the scenic and engineering marvels of the Victorian era. Ridership over the loop continued quite steady into the 1920s, but eventually America's love affair with the automobile would win out. In the summer of 1926, Colorado Southern discontinued all passenger and baggage train service between Denver and Silver Plume, simply due to a lack of interest. They continued running freight trains on an as-needed basis, but by the end of the 1930s, the effects of the Great Depression had started in. On January 1st, 1939, Colorado Southern petitioned with the Interstate Commerce Commission to abandon its narrow gauge holdings. Receiving permission shortly after their filing, they began tearing up the track, cutting up the engines and bridges for scrap. Our story would have ended right then and there, as it did for so many of the narrow gauge railroads that once flourished in Colorado, had it not been for, of all things, the automobile. In 1955, the State Highway Department was reviewing proposals for what would eventually become Interstate 70. The proposed route between Georgetown and Silver Plume would have come right up the middle of the valley, following Clear Creek just as the railroad had done 75 years before. Had it been built that way, much of the railroad and mining history in the valley would have been lost forever. To preserve all of this for future generations, the State Historical Society was successful in the preservation campaign, which not only acquired the 2,200 acres that you're visiting today, but also got a section of I-70 relocated up onto the side of Republican Mountain, thus preserving the entire part of the valley. Starting in 1973, with the help of the U.S. Navy Seabees, materials donated by the Union Pacific Railroad, and the use of locomotives and coaches already in service on an excursion railroad in Central City, the restoration of the loop had begun. But the biggest obstacle was the scrapping of the Devil's Gate High Bridge in 1939. Without the high bridge, the loop could not be completed. It was then the Venture Foundation of Denver stepped up with a grant in the amount of $1 million, which allowed for a replica of the hybrid to be completed and the first train to roll over it just in time for the railroad's 100th anniversary in 1984. Idea of just how steep a grade that is. Our maximum consist is 1 locomotive and 9 cars. If we get onto the straightaway up ahead, if we have a 9-car train, the passengers at the back will be 12 feet higher than the locomotive engineer. Now, as we get onto this straightaway, we're going to be going through a rather large field of boulders, and that hooks up with both sides of the train. The railroad passed through this boulder field in 3 places on its trip between Georgetown and Silverwood, and it posed quite a challenge to the builders of the original railroad back in the summer of 1882. All of these rocks you see strewn about you were originally part of the mountain, but they were torn free by glaciers as they retreated through this part of Colorado. As those glaciers melted, these rocks, some of which are the size of a small house, dropped out of the bottom and came to rest.
Number 6 and 2. We have a plan to As the train travels west out of town, you will see one of two territorial prisons that were built west of the Mississippi. Construction on what's now called Old Max began in 1868. The walls, towers, and original cell blocks were built from the mountain behind it, which at the time was a quarry and part of the compound. As Highway 50 curves away, a stone marker points to where Zebulon Pike and his men camped for the winter in 1806 and 1807. Pike was commissioned by the U.S. government to explore the southwest portion of the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase. Thinking they had found the Red River, they explored the Arkansas River. On the return trip, they explored the Royal Gorge and ended up climbing out of Pike Gulch, which is where the inclined railway is now located. Pike came back to camp and wrote in his journal that the gorge was impassable, and not even the animals could make trails through the gorge. This is now called Tunnel Drive, which serves as a beautiful 2-mile hiking and biking trail. You'll see more of the old Canyon City waterline as we continue further west into the Royal Gorge. As we travel further into the canyon, Great Creek flows into the Arkansas River from the south. Its headwaters are in the Wet Mountain Valley. In 1881, a narrow gauge train line was built that followed Great Creek up to the beautiful mountain town of West Cliff. The tracks had to cross Great Creek 24 times. Due to poor design, it's most any month of the year. World-class rock climbing and unbeatable whitewater rafting round out some of the more popular outdoor activities. Today, we're following the tumbling waters of the Arkansas River. The river's headwaters begin at the Continental Divide above the historic town of Leadville. From there, the river plunges 4,700 feet and just over 120 miles to the Royal Gorge. The Arkansas River then flows 1,450 miles across Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and finally into Arkansas to the confluence of the Mississippi River. As we travel deeper into the Royal Gorge, we'll explore the geological processes that created this famous canyon, why rail travel through the Royal Gorge was desirable, and how the incredible feat of laying track and running trains through the gorge became a reality. In the 1960s, miners descended on the upper Arkansas Valley of Colorado in search of carbonate ores rich in lead and silver. These miners were desperate for reliable transportation, and the railroads were happy to oblige. On October 27, 1870, along with other investors, Palmer incorporated the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad with a capital stock of $2.5 million. Palmer proposed to build the shortest narrow gauge route to Leadville. Palmer's proposed mainline route went south from Denver to the Arkansas River near Pueblo, west through the Royal Gorge to Salida, and over Poncha Pass to the San Luis Valley and along the Rio Grande River, then on to El Paso, Texas. About the same time, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad proposed laying tracks along the same route. Ordinarily, this wouldn't be a problem for two railroads to build competing lines, but there was a problem just west of Canyon City, as there was just not enough room for two railroads to occupy the Royal Gorge. The narrow gorge was an obstacle that would result in the 2-year Royal Gorge War between the railroads in their race to the new bonanza. Cautions and court orders were ignored. Newspaper reporters exaggerated threats of violence, for then as now, sensational news sold papers. There were fistfights, and a few broken bones resulted when competing track men swung pickaxes and clubs at each other. Both railroads provided their men with guns. Survey stakes were moved and both railroads raced to be the first to throw dirt to prove they were the rightful party. The Santa Fe even went so far as to hire Bat Masterson and some of his men to protect their progress. Fortresses were built to guard the roadbeds from invading work crews and possible violence. Both parties would intercept telegraph messages so each knew what the other was doing. After 2 years of battles, legal and court actions, and financial negotiations, the matter was finally settled. Jay Gould, the powerful railroad baron for the Union Pacific, did what the courts could not. He got the owners together and settled their argument. The Denver and Rio Grande got back its railroad. It had to pay the Santa Fe $1.8 million for the railroad it had built in the gorge. Denver and Rio Grande construction resumed and the rails reached Leadville on July 20th, 1880. The Royal Gorge War was over. The area we are now passing through was the location of what was known as the fact that inmate labor was being used for the construction, which meant no explosives. All tunnels and ledges that you see were drilled and chiseled using hand tools. The Museum of Colorado Prisons has a record from the biennial report of 1908 to 1910 that references both the Tunnel Gang and the Gorge Gang of trustees. The report states, they have driven a tunnel in the Royal Gorge for the Canyon City Water Works. By this work, the prisoners have earned $2,584 in water to be used by the prison or sold, as the administration chooses. There is an inscription carved into the rocks at the bottom of the gorge that has long been attributed to these inmates that reads, "The way of the transgressor is hard." The pipeline was constructed mainly of California and Oregon redwood, lumber that was brought from the west coast to Canyon City by rail. The pipeline was essentially an 8-mile-long wooden barrel that descended along the banks of the Arkansas River at the same rate as the river itself. The force of gravity, combined with the enclosed pipeline, created enough pressure to push the water into town, uphill to the water treatment plant, through 2 sedimentation filtration tanks, and into the public water supply. The pipeline was completed in late 1909 and began carrying water to Canyon City in early 1910. Water continued to run through this pipeline until March 1973.
I wish my history class was as good. 1973.
The Hanging Bridge was once a stopping point for passenger trains and has played host to several historical figures and important moments in history. On May 8, 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt stopped on the Hanging Bridge and had his photo taken in front of the locomotive. 5 years later, in February of 1910, the Chicago White Sox, on a westbound train headed to San Francisco for spring training, stopped and posed for a photo in front of the DNRG 752 locomotive. Today, we stop on the Hanging Bridge in order to remember those who traveled before us and share the same spectacular views they once enjoyed. There were two major geologic processes at play in the formation of the Roe Gorge: upheaval and erosion. Around 3 million years ago, in the late Cretaceous period, the ancient shallow seas of the area began to retreat. Mountains began to rise, and cracks were torn into the Earth's surface, resulting in upheaval. The gorge itself was over 1,200 feet deep and 30 feet wide at its narrowest point. The Roe Gorge has been referred to as the Grand Canyon of the Arkansas River. However, fun fact, the difference between a gorge and a canyon is that a gorge is deeper than it is wide, or a canyon is wider than it is deep. So, the Roe Gorge is, in fact, a gorge and not a canyon.
Just hang on to the rail and step from one to the other. You'll be just fine. You just tap point that out to get the The window, up or down your foot. If you open them, you're going to get smoke and stuff in the window, and you're going to get something in it. That's okay. This is safe.
Clean surfaces and stuff like that, if there's no. And then also we do have markings, like she said, in the concession card and stuff like that, 6-foot ditches. Also up in the open card as well. Just so you guys know. Okay? Yeah. Thank you.
You're right, Tom. It's good. What's the car? Just want to let you know that be extra careful going between these two cars. Here we go. All right.
here we go. Is everybody ready for a train ride? Oh, come on, we got a good crowd. Is everybody ready for a train ride? The sequence of horns you may have heard, too long, a short, and a long, will be blown at every crossing. This is FRA regulation, and it does alert cars and pedestrians that we are in fact a moving train. Too long, a short, and a long also used to stand for the letter Q, which used to mean that the Queen had the right of way. Now coming up on the downhill side of the train, we will begin to pass by an old freight depot. This old freight depot served Leadville back in its day, but just recently it was restored and remodeled, and it now serves as a Leadville Convention Center. Also coming up on the downhill side of the train, we will begin to pass by an old three-story brick building. This old three-story brick building used to serve as Leadville's St. Vincent's Hospital. This building was built in 1904 by the Sisters of Charity, and it served as Leadville's primary hospital until the new one was built in 1957. Today, it now serves as condos, and some residents say that spirits still haunt the halls. Now located on the downhill side of the train, way up there in the mountains, you may notice a large body of water. This large body of water is known as Turquoise Lake. Turquoise Lake is a man-made lake, and it is so named due to the large turquoise deposits that were found in and around its area. Now located on the uphill side of the train, the large mountain you see with a very flat top is known as Prospect Mountain. Our journey today will take us around and to the back of Prospect Mountain. Now coming up on the downhill side of the train, we will begin to pass by some of our extra train cars. We will begin to pass by a caboose and a rather odd-looking train car. This odd-looking train car is known as a flanger car. This flanger car is so designed as it does remove snow off of our tracks. Now coming up on the downhill side of the train, we will begin to pass by our roundhouse. Our roundhouse was originally a 6-stalled roundhouse, but when this line was converted from narrow gauge to standard gauge in 1943, 3 of the stalls were removed, the doors were raised and widened to accommodate the much larger standard gauge steam engines. We do get a chance to see our other engine 1918. More better known to the train crew as Tough and Ready. The engine we're currently using is engine 1714, or as we like to call her, Pride and Joy. These two engines are both GP9 diesel electric engines, and they were both built in the mid-1950s.
platforms, some of which can reach over 200 feet off the ground and can reach speeds of up to 45 miles an hour. Steam engines. May begin to wonder, the tracks do not line up with watercolor whatsoever. And this is due to an incident that happened here on June 23rd, 1980. An engineer and